After World War II, the idea of rearming Germany sounded impossible, politically suicidal, morally radioactive, the kind of policy you didn't even say out loud, because saying it made you look either naive or dangerous. And yet, Winston Churchill moved toward it, not because he forgot the war, not because he forgave it, but because he was already thinking about the next one. Here's the shocking part. The secret idea behind rearming Germany wasn't kindness, it wasn't redemption, it was control, it was leverage, it was deterrence built into a machine. Because history doesn't stop, it only changes shape. And when it changes shape, the math changes with it. Most people hear this topic and they want a moral story. They want the bad guys punished forever. They want the lesson to be simple. They want never again to mean never again under any circumstances. But Churchill's world wasn't built on feelings. It was built on balance, on force, on geography. On what happens when your enemy gets a vote in your future. And the enemy was changing. But before we get there, you have to feel what rearming Germany meant in the late 1940s, because it wasn't a policy debate, it was a fear trigger. Europe had just been destroyed. Cities were ash. Economies were cracked. Families were still counting the dead. So when you said Germany with an army again, people didn't hear strategy. They heard footsteps. They heard 1939. They heard the past trying to climb out of the grave. That meant any leader even hinting at German rearmament was playing with political fire. You didn't just risk elections, you risked legitimacy. You risked losing the public's trust in the entire post-war order. And the taboo wasn't irrational. Germany had done it before. Twice. The continent had a muscle memory, an instinct. Keep Germany down, keep Germany disarmed, keep Germany contained. So why would Churchill do the opposite? Because taboos are based on yesterday's threat. And Churchill was staring at tomorrow's. Here's the pivot. Fear doesn't disappear just because you want it to. It evolves, it relocates, it finds a new object. And after 1945, a new fear rose in the East. At first, the West wanted to believe the war had ended cleanly. One enemy defeated, one peace secured, one chapter closed. But reality didn't cooperate, because the moment Germany collapsed, the power vacuum didn't stay empty, it filled. Soviet influence pushed westward, political systems hardened, borders turned into pressure lines, and Europe, exhausted, became the terrain of a new contest. This is the part people miss. The alliance that would become the West wasn't built out of celebration. It was built out of panic, carefully managed. Because there's a difference between victory and security. You can win a war and still lose the peace. That meant the question for Churchill wasn't, how do we punish Germany forever? It was, how do we prevent the next catastrophe? And in his mind, the next catastrophe didn't come from a defeated Germany, it came from a rising Soviet Union. Now this is where the story gets uncomfortable, fast. Churchill wasn't thinking like a judge, he was thinking like a strategist. And strategists don't ask, who deserves what? They ask, what prevents collapse? So he looked at a map. Not a speech, not a memorial, a map. Because maps don't care about morality, maps care about distance, terrain, supply, and time. And when you look at Europe after World War II, one fact jumps out. If the front line becomes Central Europe, Germany is no longer just the memory of the last war. Germany becomes the ground where the next war is decided. That's the brutal logic, not pretty, not comforting, but logical. Because if the Soviet army is the threat, the West needs a credible barrier, a real one, not a moral one. That meant the alliance couldn't be built on memory alone. It had to be built on power. And power, in Europe, is never just about who has the biggest army. It's about who has the position. Germany's position is a lever. It sits in the center. It touches the routes, the rivers, the roads, the industrial corridors, the lines that armies use and economies depend on. So if you wanted to deter the Soviet Union, you had to solve a problem that speeches could not solve. The center of Europe could not remain a void. Because a void invites pressure. A void invites expansion. A void invites someone else to fill it. That meant the West faced a terrible choice. Keep Germany weak and accept that Central Europe stays vulnerable, or rebuild German capability and accept the political and psychological backlash. And Churchill's view was simple. Vulnerability is more dangerous than outrage. Because outrage is emotional, vulnerability is strategic. Now, rearming Germany sounds like one big reckless switch, like you just hand the keys back and hope for the best. But that's not what Churchill was aiming for. Here's the micro-reveal that flips the entire story. Rearming can be designed as a form of containment. Not freedom, constraint. Not an unleashed force, an integrated force. Because the real nightmare wasn't Germany becomes strong. The real nightmare was Germany becomes strong outside your system. A Germany outside a Western alliance is a question mark, a bargaining chip, a swing actor, a potential neutral that can be pressured, bribed, or flipped. A Germany inside the system is something else. It's predictable. And in deterrence, predictability is power. That meant the secret idea wasn't to revive a threat. It was to lock German strength into a structure that could not be easily turned against the West. A structure where commands are shared, where planning is coordinated, where equipment is standardized, where the political costs of going rogue are enormous. Because the West didn't just need soldiers. It needed a design that made German power usable and controllable at the same time. And this is where the taboo starts to crack. Not because people stopped fearing Germany, they didn't. Not because they suddenly trusted Germany, they didn't. The taboo cracked because another fear grew larger. Because when an enemy changes, the math changes. And the West's new math looked like this. Without a strong center, the alliance is a shell. With a strong center, embedded, the alliance becomes a wall. But to build that wall, leaders had to reshape the story people told themselves after the war. They had to replace "Germany must never rise again" with something far colder. Germany must rise, but inside a cage we control. And that is why Churchill's position sounded insane until the Cold War made it logical. Now, if you're here for history explained like power mechanics, subscribe. This isn't about heroes and villains. It's about how systems force choices people hate. Because the uncomfortable truth is this: the post-war world didn't offer clean options. It offered trade-offs, and Churchill was choosing the trade-off that increased Western leverage. So the real question becomes sharper and more dangerous. If rearming Germany was not forgiveness, what was it exactly? What did Churchill think rearmament would achieve? What did he think it would prevent? And what kind of alliance do you have to build so that rearming becomes a leash, not a release? Because once you answer that, you see the story clearly. It wasn't about Germany. It was about the Soviet Union. It was about deterrence. It was about turning the center of Europe from a liability into a controlled asset. And once that idea takes hold, everything that follows, the diplomacy, the deals, the careful language, the institutional designs, stops looking like contradiction. It starts looking like engineering. The kind of engineering that doesn't ask for approval from memory. It asks for obedience from reality. And reality in the late 1940s was sending a message the West could not ignore. If Central Europe is the line, then Germany is not optional. Germany is the terrain. And terrain decides outcomes. The Cold War didn't begin with a single announcement. It began with a feeling. The feeling that the war you just survived hadn't really ended, because the struggle behind it was still alive. Only the uniforms changed. The slogans changed. The borders changed. And that meant the West had a problem that wasn't emotional. It was structural. Because the Soviet Union didn't need to invade in the way people imagined invasion. It could apply pressure and watch the map tilt. It could turn weakness into concessions. It could turn fear into compliance. And Europe was full of weakness. That's why Churchill's logic starts to make sense when you stop asking what people wanted and start asking what they could afford. Britain was exhausted. Not metaphorically, literally. Debt, rationing, demobilization, an empire pulling apart at the seams. France was wounded and politically unstable. The United States was powerful but distant, and still debating how permanent its presence in Europe should be. So the West had a credibility gap, because deterrence isn't a slogan. Deterrence is a promise your enemy believes. That meant if the Soviet Union looked west and saw a hollow center, it wouldn't see restraint, it would see opportunity. Now we need to say something clearly. Churchill wasn't building a case for German strength as a moral rehabilitation program. He wasn't trying to restore German pride. He was trying to fix the West's geometry. Because if the front line is Central Europe, you can't defend it from the coastline. You can't defend it from speeches. You can't defend it with guilt. You defend it with mass, infrastructure, readiness, and the ability to move faster than your enemy. And those things don't appear by wishing. That meant the real target of rearmament wasn't Berlin, it was Moscow, or more precisely, Soviet calculations. Churchill's mind was on Soviet arithmetic. He wanted to change the numbers that Kremlin planners saw when they looked at Europe. Because the point of deterrence is not to be stronger in the abstract. It's to make the other side doubt the payoff of aggression. Make it costly, make it uncertain, make it slow, make it risky. That meant the West needed a barrier that was not just symbolic. It needed a barrier that could hold long enough for help to arrive. And if help is coming from across an ocean, long enough is not a small requirement. This is where geography becomes destiny. Look at the map and the problem is obvious. Germany is the hinge, the bridge, the corridor. It's the space between the Soviet sphere and the Atlantic. So when people say Germany shouldn't have an army, they're really saying the center of Europe should stay weak. And weakness in the center is not neutral. It's an invitation, because every power system has a gravity. If you don't anchor the center, someone else will. That meant the West faced an ugly reality. You can't build a stable European balance while the most important piece of European terrain is treated only as a corpse. You need it alive, functioning, defensible. Now, there's a reason this feels morally wrong. Because the last time Germany was rearmed, it didn't become a defensive wall, it became a battering ram. So the fear wasn't irrational. But fear can still be strategically useless. Because the Soviet Union didn't care about Western trauma. The Soviet Union cared about Western capability. And capability had gaps. This is the part where Churchill's power-first framing becomes ruthless. He looks at the West's resources and he sees constraint. Money, men, industry, political attention, all limited. And then he looks at the Soviet position, a land empire with depth, with proximity, with a massive conventional force structure near the key theater. That meant if the West wanted to avoid war, it had to make war look unwinnable, not morally unacceptable, militarily unprofitable. So the real argument becomes, how do you create enough conventional mass in Europe without bankrupting Britain, without relying entirely on America, and without leaving France terrified of its neighbor? And the answer, uncomfortable but obvious, was that you can't do it without Germany. Because Germany is not just geography. Germany is capacity. Even in ruins, Germany had industrial potential, skilled labor, infrastructure that could be rebuilt faster than a country starting from nothing. And that meant German contribution wasn't merely helpful, it was the only way to make the numbers close. Here's the cold chain. The Soviet threat becomes the primary threat. Because of that, the front line becomes Central Europe. Because of that, the West needs mass on that front line. Because of that, Germany cannot remain a void. And because Germany cannot remain a void, the taboo begins to die. Not because people wanted it to die, because reality suffocated it. Now, at this point, critics might say, why not just keep Germany disarmed and station Allied forces there permanently? Here's why that sounds better than it is. Because permanent occupation is expensive, politically corrosive, strategically fragile. It turns Germany into a dependent, a resentful one. It makes the West responsible for everything, while Germany contributes little. and it leaves the Soviets one propaganda line away from calling the West imperial in the heart of Europe. That meant the Keep Germany Weak Forever plan creates a different nightmare. It forces the West to be everywhere, forever. It forces the United States to stay engaged at maximum intensity. It forces Britain and France to carry burdens they cannot carry. And it keeps the German question unresolved, hanging over Europe like a storm cloud. And unresolved questions don't stay unresolved. They get answered by the strongest actor in the room. So Churchill's approach was not to ignore the German question, but to solve it in a way that increased Western leverage. Now notice what's happening. This is not about liking Germany. This is about preventing Germany from becoming a swing door between East and West. Because a weak Germany is not safe. A weak Germany is purchasable. It can be pressured. It can be infiltrated. It can be bribed. It can be offered unity under Soviet terms. And the West could not allow that. That meant the West needed West Germany to be anchored. Anchored economically. Anchored politically. And yes, anchored militarily. But there's another reason this became urgent. Berlin. Berlin was a warning shot, a proof that the Soviets were willing to test line. Even without firing, pressure could create crises. Blockades, ultimatums, the kinds of moves that reveal whether your alliance is real or decorative. And every crisis forces the same question: who will actually bleed for this? Deterrence is the answer you give before you're asked. Because if you wait for the question, you're already behind. That meant, to Churchill, the West had to move faster than public opinion, faster than post-war comfort, faster than the illusion that peace is automatic. So he pushed a message that sounded harsh but was strategically coherent. If you want Europe defended, Europe must defend itself. And if Europe must defend itself, Germany cannot be excluded from the defense architecture. And if Germany cannot be excluded, then the only safe way forward is controlled rearmament inside a system. Now we're close to the core. Because once you accept that Germany has to be part of the defense of Central Europe, you have to decide what kind of Germany you want. A Germany with an army outside your control is the nightmare everyone remembers. But a Germany with an army inside a Western structure? That creates a different kind of stability. Not moral stability, mechanical stability. That meant rearmament wasn't a celebration. It was a design choice, a way to convert a former enemy into a predictable component of a larger machine. But here's the trapdoor insight that makes this whole story click. The alliance wasn't just protecting Germany from the Soviet Union, it was also protecting Europe from Germany by embedding Germany. Because integration is a form of restraint. It binds you to shared planning, shared standards, shared command logic, shared political costs. It turns rearmament into something that can be managed rather than feared. But the price of that is obvious. Because when you embed a country, you don't just give it security. You take something in return. You take options. You take autonomy. You take the ability to play both sides. And that's why the next part of the story isn't really about tanks and uniforms. It's about the machine that makes a rearmed Germany safe enough for the West to accept. Because if rearmament was going to happen, it had to come with a leash. A system strong enough that German power becomes a tool of the alliance, not a threat to it. And once that system is designed, the taboo doesn't just fade. It gets replaced. Replaced by a new fear, not Germany will rise again, but the USSR will win the center if we don't. And that fear, more than guilt, more than memory, rewrote the math. At this point, most people still misunderstand what rearming Germany meant in Churchill's logic. They imagine a switch. Germany disarmed, then Germany armed again. As if history repeats in one clean, terrifying snap. But that's not how power systems work. Because rearming isn't just about weapons. It's about who holds the steering wheel. And Churchill's secret idea was simple, cold, and very modern. If Germany must be strong, then Germany must be strong inside the alliance. Not outside it, not beside it, inside it. Because strength outside your system is a threat. Strength inside your system is an asset. if you design the system correctly. That's the inversion. Rearming can be built as a cage, not a cage made of bars, a cage made of procedures, standards, command chains, political dependencies, shared planning. The kind of cage that doesn't look like a cage until someone tries to leave. Here's the part people miss. Rearmed does not mean unleashed. It can mean restricted, embedded, audited, integrated. It can mean capability without independence. Because the nightmare of the 1930s wasn't just that Germany had an army. It was that Germany had an army that answered only to Germany. That meant the post-war solution couldn't be Germany gets power back. It had to be Germany gets power back under conditions that make misuse difficult and costly. And those conditions were not moral conditions, they were structural conditions. You don't prevent betrayal by trusting people more. You prevent betrayal by limiting options. So let's break down what control actually looks like when it's engineered. First, integration. Not friendly visits, not symbolic treaties. Integration means your military is designed to operate with mine. Your plans fit inside my plans. Your logistics depend on shared pipelines. Your equipment matches shared standards. Because when everything is connected, going rogue becomes technically hard and politically obvious. That meant a rearmed Germany inside the Western system would not be a free-floating force. It would be a component, a part, a gear. Second, command and planning. The most dangerous thing in Europe wasn't German soldiers. It was German decision-making without constraints. So the alliance model shifts the key question from, do you have troops, to who controls how they're used? Because control is deterrence in another form. It deters your own side from doing something stupid. That meant embedding Germany wasn't only about deterring Moscow. It was also about ensuring that Germany could not act alone in a way that dragged Europe into chaos. Third, limits that look like cooperation. This is how modern power works. You don't just ban something, you shape it. You don't simply say no, you say yes, but in our format. Yes, but with our training. Yes, but with our doctrine. Yes, but with our supply chain. Yes, but inside our political framework. Because the format is the leash. That meant the alliance didn't have to pretend Germany was harmless. It had to make Germany predictable. And predictability is the opposite of panic. Now notice what's happening. The story stops being former enemy becomes friend. It becomes former enemy becomes managed. That's a different kind of peace, not based on affection, based on architecture. And Churchill understood something that sounds cynical, but is brutally true. In international politics, trust is nice, dependence is reliable, because dependence creates consequences. If you depend on the alliance for security, you don't casually threaten the alliance. If your economy and defense are welded into a shared order, you don't casually sabotage that order. That meant the West could take a country that used to be the biggest destabilizer in Europe and turn it into a stabilizing pillar by making it costly for that country to deviate. Not impossible, costly. And cost is what shapes behavior. Now, the critics would say, isn't that humiliating? Isn't that treating Germany like a controlled experiment? Yes, and that's exactly why it could work. Because the alternative was worse. The alternative was a Germany either permanently occupied, permanently resentful, or permanently tempted to seek another patron. And the Soviet Union would love that. Because the Soviet dream wasn't necessarily tanks rolling to the Atlantic on day one. The Soviet dream was division, a fractured West, a neutral Germany, a Germany that hesitates, a Germany that bargains. Because a bargaining Germany is a lever Moscow can pull. That meant the West needed to remove bargaining from Germany's future, not by force, by design. This is why Churchill's logic is power first. He wasn't asking, what is Germany allowed to be? He was asking, what configuration makes Germany least dangerous and most useful in a new strategic era? Because utility is how alliances survive. And here's the uncomfortable micro-reveal. The alliance wasn't just built to stop the USSR. It was built to organize the West, and organizing the West meant organizing Germany. Because Germany was too central to be left unorganized. So the secret idea behind the alliance is not just military, it's political, it's a settlement. A settlement that trades one kind of danger for another kind of stability. Because you can't erase Germany, you can only place Germany. Inside which structure? Under which incentives? With which constraints? That meant rearmament wasn't a moral reversal. It was a placement decision. Put German capability where it can't easily be turned into independent leverage. Put it where it contributes to deterrence but cannot become a separate center of power. And that's where the alliance becomes a machine. People romanticize alliances as friendships of democracies. But alliances are machines that convert resources into deterrence. They take budgets, factories, manpower, and geography, and they output a single message to the enemy. This won't be easy. This won't be fast. This won't be cheap. So don't do it. That meant Germany's role wasn't forgiven partner. It was necessary gear. A gear that had to be fitted precisely or it would grind the whole machine apart. Now we get to the deal that nobody wanted to admit, because every time you embed a country, you're making a trade. You give protection, you take independence. You give status, you take strategic flexibility. You give a seat at the table, you take the option to flip the table. And Germany, after 1945, was in no position to demand a clean, proud return to sovereignty as if nothing happened. So the West offered a bargain that could be sold as dignity, but functioned as restraint. Security in exchange for integration. Not because integration is morally beautiful, because integration is operationally useful. That meant Germany's rearmament could be presented to the public not as Germany is back, but as Germany is being contained in a new way. Contained not by occupation alone, but by participation. And participation is the clever part, because it feels voluntary, even when the structure is doing the controlling. Now, think about the politics of selling this. The public hears rearmed Germany and thinks the past is returning. So leaders had to change the language. They didn't say, "We are rebuilding German power." They said, "We are building collective defense." They didn't say, "Germany will be strong." They said, "Europe will be secure." They didn't say, "We trust Germany." They said, "We will supervise the framework." Because words are part of containment too. That meant the alliance was designed with two audiences in mind at the same time. Moscow to be deterred, and the Western public to be calmed. Deterrence requires strength. Public support requires reassurance. So the system had to do both. It had to look like defense and function like control. Now we can say the key sentence again, and it lands with full weight. Rearming was a tool, not a reward. It was not a medal for good behavior. It was not a moral graduation ceremony. It was a strategic instrument. Because the West didn't need Germany to feel proud, it needed the Soviet Union to feel uncertain. And that meant the alliance had to be credible. Credible on paper, credible on the map, credible in planning rooms, credible enough that the Kremlin would look at Central Europe and see not a vacuum, but a wall, built from integrated parts. Now, if you like this kind of history, where politics is explained as design and pressure, not myth, subscribe. Because the real world isn't run by lessons, it's run by incentives. And Churchill's secret idea was to build a post-war incentive structure where Germany's safest path was also the West's safest outcome. Not because anyone loved it, because the alternative was worse. That's why the taboo didn't disappear. It was replaced by a larger fear. And once you replace a fear, you can sell a policy that would have been unthinkable years earlier. Not as forgiveness, as necessity, as engineering, as controlled power inside the machine. Once you accept the logic of controlled rearmament, the rest of the story stops feeling like a contradiction and starts feeling like a blueprint. Because the moment Germany is embedded, the entire Western position in Europe changes. Not emotionally, mechanically. The alliance becomes heavier, more credible, more permanent. That meant deterrence stops being a promise on paper and becomes a posture on the ground. And posture is what enemies actually respond to. So what did this create? First, it created mass where mass mattered. Not just troops, but readiness, planning, a structure that could respond without improvising at the last second. Because improvisation is what collapses alliances in a crisis. That meant integration wasn't only about stopping Germany from acting alone, it was about preventing the West from acting chaotically. A chaotic alliance is an invitation. It signals weakness, disagreement, delay. And delay is the enemy's best friend. Second, it created standardization. That sounds boring. It's not. Standardization means your forces can actually fight together. Your logistics don't collapse on day 3. Your ammunition fits. Your radios talk. Your doctrine is aligned enough that you don't burn time debating basics while the enemy moves. Because modern war is not just bravery, it's supply. And supply is coordination. That meant the alliance wasn't merely adding German strength. It was converting European pieces into a single operational system, a machine. And machines are the opposite of panic. Third, it created permanence. This is the part that doesn't get said in speeches. If your entire security architecture depends on Germany being embedded, then you are not building a temporary arrangement. You're building a long-term order. Because once you weld things together, militarily, economically, politically, pulling them apart becomes expensive. That meant the alliance became more than a coalition. It became a structure that shaped European choices for decades. Now, here's the uncomfortable truth. Every structure that provides security also extracts a cost. And the cost here was sovereignty. Not just Germany's sovereignty, everyone's. Because collective defense requires collective constraint. That meant countries inside the alliance gained protection, but lost freedom of movement. Less room to bargain. Less room to drift. Less room to play the third option. And that wasn't a bug, it was the point. Because the West didn't want Germany as a swing actor ever again. A swing actor is a crack in the wall, and cracks are where pressure goes. So the West didn't just rearm Germany, it integrated Germany into a permanent set of incentives. If Germany stays inside the system, it is protected and prosperous. If Germany tries to step out, it loses security, loses credibility, loses economic stability, loses political trust. That meant the system was designed to make the safe choice also the selfish choice. And when selfish and safe align, structures last. But permanence has a second side, because when you build your security around a front line, you normalize the front line. The West line was not in the Atlantic, it was in Central Europe. That meant Europe's post-war peace wasn't a peace without danger. It was a peace with danger managed at the boundary, managed tension. A cold peace. Not because people wanted it to be cold, because the map forced it. Now let's face the moral question head on. Was this right? Was it wise? Was it fair? Those questions matter, but they are not the questions that built the alliance. The question that built the alliance was, what prevents collapse? Because collapse is what creates the conditions for the next catastrophe. Churchill's argument, stripped of rhetoric, is brutal. Punishment does not deter the next enemy. Capability does. Memory does not stop pressure. Posture does. Moral clarity does not hold a line. Mass does. That meant Churchill wasn't abandoning the past. He was refusing to let the past become a trap. Because if the West stayed frozen in moral outrage, it would hand the future to a new power that didn't care about moral outrage at all. Now, critics can still say, this is cynical. This is treating Germany like a tool. Yes, it is. And that is exactly why it could function. Because rearmament wasn't offered as absolution. It was offered as a structured role inside a larger design. And design is how you manage risk. Here's the core trade-off laid bare. A rearmed Germany outside the Western system is a threat. A disarmed Germany in the center of Europe is a vulnerability. A rearmed Germany inside the system is a controlled asset. That's the triad. Churchill chose the third option because it reduced the worst risks at the same time. Not all risks, but the worst ones. Because no policy removes danger, it only redistributes it. That meant the alliance didn't solve the German problem in a moral sense. It solved it in a strategic sense. By turning Germany into a pillar that couldn't easily tilt without bringing the whole structure down with it. Now, here's the line that seals the verdict. The secret idea wasn't kindness. It was controlled necessity. And controlled necessity is the foundation of a lot of post-war stability. People want to believe peace is made by good intentions. Sometimes it is. But in the early Cold War, peace was more often made by systems that made war unattractive. Deterrence is not a handshake, it's a lock. And the alliance, at its core, was a lock. A lock designed to keep the Soviet Union out, and, quietly, to keep Germany in. Because keeping Germany in was how you prevented Germany from becoming a separate center of gravity again. Now we can end where we began, but with the logic fully exposed. After World War II, rearming Germany sounded insane. Because everyone remembered what German military power had done. But Churchill didn't push rearmament because he forgot. He pushed because the enemy changed. And once the enemy changes, the map becomes a weapon. And once the map becomes a weapon, you need a structure that can hold the center. That's what this was. Not a moral reset, a strategic build, a firewall against the future. So the verdict is simple, and it's cold. Churchill wanted Germany rearmed because alliances are built on deterrence, not emotion. The secret idea wasn't to revive a threat, it was to lock German strength inside a structure designed to resist a new one. Not because the past was forgiven, because the future was feared.